Hello, and welcome to a special episode of the Reykjavik News Desk. This one is called Hitchhiking Around Iceland, a Memoir, because in this video, I'll be sharing with you some of the stories of the adventures that I've had hitchhiking around Iceland, as well as giving you some advice on how to hitchhike around Iceland safely, comfortably, and responsibly. So without further ado, let's get into it. First of all, is it safe to hitchhike in Iceland? Well, no country is 100% safe to hitchhike in, of course, but Iceland is probably one of the safer countries to hitchhike in for sure. Now, that being said, there are definitely some safety precautions that you should take, which I'm going to mention later on in the video. But by and large, yes, Iceland is absolutely a safe country to hitchhike in. But a lot has changed over the years between when I first went hitchhiking around the country and today. Circumstances are a bit different, so you might run into difficulties that I didn't run into the first time I went hitchhiking. But anyway, let's start at the start. The first time I went hitchhiking in Iceland was actually my first trip to the country in 1998. And I'd say the biggest change between hitchhiking then and hitchhiking now is that you're going to be competing with a lot more people on the road. Like the last time I went hitchhiking, I saw people by at the side of the road with these really pretty hand-drawn signs that they put a lot of care and detail into, and who were smiling brightly at the oncoming traffic. These were the people I was competing against for rides, and it was a little daunting. When I first came here, hitchhiking wasn't really a thing people did, and so it was much easier to get picked up. Another thing that's changed is that you're consequently more likely to be picked up by tourists than Icelanders these days, and that can have a lot of interesting results. You get to meet people from all over the world this way, so that's pretty cool. But anyway, my first hitchhiking trip actually began at Keflavik International Airport. I wouldn't recommend doing this today for reasons that I'll get to later, but what I did is I saw this couple who were already talking to this Californian guy that was on the plane with me. And so I decided to roll the dice, and I approached them, and I was like, hey, can you give me a ride to Reykjavik? And they said yes. And it turned out that they owned a horse farm outside of Mosfellsbær. And so as we were driving there and we were making the usual small talk, and the guy in the couple said he was a horse farmer, I made the mistake of saying, oh yeah, I like Icelandic horses. They look a lot like ponies. And his expression suddenly got very stern, and he was like, they're not ponies. And I was like, oh, well, I know they're not ponies, but they look like ponies. And he's, no, they're not ponies. They're horses. They're Icelandic horses. They've been around since the Viking age. I was like, all right, man. All right, sorry. Anyway, they took me the whole way to Reykjavik. And just as an aside, Reykjavik was a much different place back then. Just to give you one example of how much tourism in particular has changed the city. When I was walking around downtown, I stepped into this one gift shop, and I asked where I could buy some bottled water. See, I'm from Baltimore, and we're always taught not to drink our own tap water because it's poisonous. Anyway, so I asked where bottled water could be found, and the woman behind the counter looked at me like I had three heads. She was like, bottled water? And I repeated myself, and she was like, you don't have to buy water here. You can just turn on the sink, the faucet, you screw the faucet and water comes out. It's free. So anyway, I stayed the night in Reykjavik, and in the morning, I hit the road again. And this brings me to my first piece of advice. Do not try to hitchhike within city limits. I learned this the hard way. I spent a long time walking down one of the main highways that goes out of Reykjavik, Miklabraut, with my thumb out, very far from the side of the road, absolutely nobody stopping because there's no place to pull over. I don't know what I was thinking. So if your journey begins in Reykjavik, there's basically two routes that you can go out of the city, either north or south. If you want to hitchhike from Reykjavik and head north, I recommend you take a bus to Mosfellsbær, which is just north of town, walk to the northern edge of that town, and then begin hitchhiking. If you want to take the southern route, you can take a bus to Hveragerði, which is to the southeast of Reykjavik, and when you get to the eastern edge of that town, begin hitchhiking there. So as you might imagine, I wasn't picked up until I got north of Mosfellsbær, where I was picked up by a very sad Belgian man whose life had fallen apart, and he said he was moving to Iceland because he lost everything. And That gave me an interesting first impression. So before I continue, there are two things that I learned through this first trip. Number one, you should have clothes for any weather condition at all, no matter the season, because Iceland's weather is extremely unpredictable. Even in the summertime, like, you're probably not going to encounter snow and ice in most parts of the country in the middle of summer, at least not in the coastal regions, but you should still, have warm clothes with you. You should have waterproof clothes with you. You should have windproof clothes with you, just in case, because, it's better to have them and not need them than the reverse. Secondly, and this is a little habit that I picked up hitchhiking in the United States, rather than standing facing traffic with your thumb out, walk with traffic with your thumb out, with your back to traffic. There's primarily for two reasons. First of all, it's just nice exercise. You feel like you're going someplace. Even though, if you get picked up, it doesn't matter if you were walking or standing still, you're going to still go the same distance. It keeps your mind occupied to do this. And secondly, if you're hitchhiking this manner with your back to traffic, people who pick you up are generally going to drive a little bit past you and pull over. This gives you a chance to see their license plate. Look at the license plate, memorize the license plate number, and go over it in your head. This is a safety precaution. So if you run into any trouble, you know to call the emergency number, which, by the way, if you didn't already know, is 112. That's the emergency number in Iceland for all services: police, ambulance, fire, 112. Okay? So memorize a license plate. You're probably not going to need to know this information, but again, better to have it and not need it than the reverse. Tangentially to this, if you get up to the side window of the car and something doesn't feel right, like the vibe is off about the driver in some way, it doesn't matter if you think they're intoxicated or they just seem creepy or just something's uncomfortable about it, just say, you know what, never mind, go ahead. It's better to be a little discourteous than to regret having gotten into the car later on. Now, I was a bit ambitious on this first trip, and I didn't really take into account just how expensive a country Iceland is, and I got all the way to Akureyri and pretty much ran out of money there. Now, the interesting thing about the leg between Reykjavik and Akureyri is this is a very well-traveled stretch of Route 1, that is the ring road which circles the country. So not only is it very easy to get picked up in this particular part of the highway, but it's also going to be very likely that whoever picks you up is going all the way to one of these points or the other. So I got to Akureyri and I was almost out of money, and I decided to stay at the campgrounds. Now, if you're hitchhiking because you're on a budget, chances are you're going to be staying in campgrounds anyway, because that's going to be your cheapest option. But if you just want to hitchhike for the adventure, but you want more cozy and comfortable accommodations, bear in mind that if you just show up in town and try to look for a spare room at a guest house or a hotel or even an Airbnb, it's going to be a roll of the dice. But campgrounds almost never fill up. So you're probably going to have better chances at a campground, and they're going to be cheaper anyway. And you never know, you might meet some interesting people too. Bear in mind as well that wild camping is against the law in Iceland. You might stumble upon a farmstead and find an agreeable farmer who will let you farm on their land, but just going out into the wilds is not a good idea. It's considered disrespectful and it could get you in trouble. So just go to a available campground, or go to a farmstead and ask politely if you may camp on their land. And if they say yes, leave nothing behind. Clean up after yourself. Don't hold a wild party or anything like that. Just be respectful. So anyway, being out of money in Akureyri, realizing I couldn't go any further, I called Icelandair and arranged to get my flight moved, which they were fortunately able to do. I realized I had to hitchhike back to Reykjavik, and I thought this was going to be the end of the journey, but oh no, it was actually just getting started. Now, this is a story I've only told a couple of times in my life because it sounds a little strange and there's the paranormal involved in it. And I'm not normally a person who believes in the paranormal. So all I'll just say about this story is to this day, I have no rational explanation for what I witnessed. So just to preface this day was a beautiful, clear day. There wasn't even any wind, which is unusual for Iceland. I was completely sober. I had slept enough. I wasn't taking any medication. And I was just walking west from Akureyri. At one point, I looked to my right and saw this incredible sight, which was this expanse of grass, bright green grass, with a stream rather, winding through it that was brown because it was runoff from snow that was melting on top of the mountains. And far in the distance, behind this grass, there were still snow-capped mountains. But what caught my eye was that standing on the banks of this stream was a person wearing a red dress. Now, they were too far away for me to be able to make out their facial features, but they had long hair, and they were wearing a red dress that went from like the neck all the way down to the grass. And they're just standing there perfectly still. And I thought, this is an incredible scene. So I picked up my camera, which was, by the way, a regular film camera. And I put this person in the dead center of the frame, and I took the photo. This person being too far away for me to make out their face, I would say they were anywhere from like 30 to 35 meters away from me, but they still were very prominent in the middle of the frame. And I thought, this is going to be a fantastic photo. So anyway, I go back to Baltimore and I take the film to a local Giant. I don't know if you know this supermarket chain. I don't even know if they're still around. Anyway, they had a photo lab there. And I dropped up my film there, and I came back 24 hours later, as guaranteed, to pick up my photos. And I really wanted to see this photo in particular. And I flipped through it, and I got to this photo, and there was the grass, there was the stream, there was the mountains, and there was the sky. But that person in the red dress simply was not there. So I flipped through the photos again. I checked the negatives. They seemed fine. I went back to the photo lab and I asked them, like, hey, did any of these negatives not turn out right? Or were there any doubles that you threw away maybe? And they said, no, it was pretty ordinary. Like, there was nothing wrong with the film at all. So as I said, I don't know what it is that I saw. I have no rational explanation for this whatsoever. But the only caveat that I can provide is that when I told this story to an Icelander from the region, they just very matter-of-factly said, oh, yeah, they used to drown people for adultery at that part of the stream. So, I don't know. Make of that what you will. Anyway, minutes after taking that photo, I ended up getting picked up by a family. That is, 2 sisters and their collectively 5 children who were in a van, and they were heading back to Hafnarfjörður, where they lived. And we had a wonderful time. We're just talking, conversing, and asking each other questions and having this great conversation. And we exchanged addresses, and we kept up a mail correspondence when I got back to the United States. And people, this family were the ones who helped me move to Iceland. So you never know what your journey around the country has in store for you. But anyway, back to story time. The first time I successfully completed the Ring Road journey, hitchhiking, was in the summer of 2000. And I would say the summer is the best time to be hitchhiking around the country. Not only is the weather the most agreeable, but also there's a lot of folks on vacation, and so there's a lot of cars on the road. Now, I had taken a southern route going through the south of Iceland, up the east, across the north, and down the west again. And of all these parts of the journey, like, I know they said that between Akureyri and Reykjavik, it's the easiest to get picked up, and you also go the farthest distance. I would say the south of Iceland is going to be the hardest part. And it's not because people in the south of Iceland are unfriendly or something, far from it, but you're going to spend a lot of time waiting for a car to come by. And when it does, there's a really good chance that they'll pick you up and say, I'm just going to the next farm down the road, which is like not even a kilometer away. So it might be like a lot of short little trips, but it's also really pretty part of the country. So, you know, it's kind of a win-win either way. Now, once I rounded the southeast corner of the country, I got picked up by a farmer and his son who were driving a pickup truck. And I don't know where they were headed because they spoke no English. And at the time, I spoke no Icelandic. And if you run into this situation, which is highly unlikely because, as I've said in other videos, most Icelanders between the age of 8 and 80 speak at least some rudimentary English. In fact, they're usually better at English than they think they are. But this was one of those rare occasions when I ran into a couple of people who didn't speak any English at all, and I spoke no Icelandic. But this did not dampen their enthusiasm for pointing out the sights to me. At least that's what I hope they were doing, as they were driving me through the east of Iceland, and they kept pointing out the window, enthusiastically talking at me. I think that they were pointing things out that were of interest, but either way, it was a really pleasant journey. And I'll never forget, there's two routes that you can essentially go up the East Coast. One is you can either go in and out of the little fjords that are going up the East Coast, or you can take this road that goes over the mountain pass and then back down directly to Eyjafjallajökull. And they chose that pass, and that was really, really something, because as we headed up into the mountains, like this fog kind of assembled very slowly, but eventually it got to where we could not see a meter in any direction. And this car is driving at a crawl, and I had no idea where we were. I presumed that we were heading up north because I couldn't think of anywhere else we were going, and I was a little bit worried that the weather was taking a turn for the worse. But then all of a sudden, I felt that we were driving downhill again, and like magic, it was like the fog lifted and the clouds parted, and there was this beautiful blue sky and this gorgeous valley with a big lagoon. Well, actually, it's more of a lake/river type of thing. Fljótsdalur. Well, that's the name of the valley. Anyway, it was a big body of water, big body of fresh water that connects to an ocean, and a little picturesque little town down there. And I said out loud, "Where are we?" And I guess the driver understood that because he said Eyjafjallajökull. And to this day, Eyjafjallajökull is one of my favorite towns in Iceland. Now, I had such a great time on this ring road trip that I decided to do it again a couple years later in October of 2002, because I figured, hey, October, that's autumn. That'll be fine, right? No, it wasn't fine. I got snowed in Eyjafjallajökull, ironically enough, where I had to spend out a lot of money at an overpriced guest house. That wasn't even really a guest house. It was somebody just renting a room in their house for like a couple days waiting for this storm to break. So that would be another piece of advice that I have for you is do not hitchhike from October to April. Okay, like it can snow outside of those months too, but it's a lot less likely to happen, at least in the coastal regions. So if you can avoid it at all, don't hitchhike from October through and including April. Following that journey, because I made some friends up in Akureyri, I was frequently hitchhiking between Reykjavik and Akureyri, like almost every other weekend. But those aren't the only 2 points I've ever hitchhiked between. At one point, when I was living in Akureyri, I saw in the newspaper a listing for an art exhibition in Seyðisfjörður, which is in northeast Iceland, whereas Akureyri, if you don't already know, is in north central Iceland. And this art exhibition looked really interesting, but I had no means of getting there, so I decided to hitchhike out there. Well, I did, and I had a lot of fun. The artist was very charming. She and I are still friends to this day. I met these two American guys and this Irish guy, and the four of us had a wonderful time together. And then at the end of this little trip, I was heading back from Seyðisfjörður, and I had one of the most harrowing, but one of the most interesting hitchhiking pickups that I'd ever had in this country. So just north of Eyjafjallajökull, I was picked up by a young man driving a Yaris, and he seemed harmless enough. And he asked me, "Do you smoke?" And I thought he meant cigarettes. So I said, "No." And he said, "Do you mind if I smoke?" And again, I thought he meant cigarettes. So I said, "No, I don't mind." And he said, "Okay." And he reached into his shirt pocket and he pulled out this giant spliff. And he just lit up and he smoked the entire thing by himself. And I was too nervous to say anything. And I was like, is he going to be okay? Is he going to be like too high to drive at some point? But he seemed fine. And for whatever stupid reason, I didn't say like, "Hey, can you pull over? I'm just going to, find another ride." I stayed in the car. And wow, let me tell you, he was an interesting guy. So after he finished his spliff, he was driving for a while in silence, just listening to the radio, when suddenly he pulled the car over and he pointed out the passenger side window and he said, look, do you see them? Do you see them?" And I looked out my window and all I could see was just an endless expanse of grass. And so I said, no, dude, I don't see them. What am I looking at? And he said, there's geese over there. There's geese. I was like, really? And I strained to look, but I couldn't see them. And he was like, wait right here. And he got out of his car. He left the keys in the ignition, the radio playing, the engine running. He opened up the back seat and he took out a shotgun. And he started walking down the embankment towards this grass. And I was like, what is happening? Like, he left 2 car doors open, the radio's on, the engine's running, the keys are in the ignition, and he's marching off into the grass with a shotgun. I thought this man had lost his mind. But then I heard this distinct pop of a distant shotgun, and sure enough, a flock of geese flew up into the air. Well, he came trundling back to the car, and he hadn't caught any geese, but people, he stopped this car 5 more times to try to hunt and shoot a single goose, didn't get a single one. And I felt so bad for him. Like, he was visibly depressed that he wasn't able to get a single goose. That we got to Lake Mivat, which, as you might know, is a little ways east of Akureyri, where I was heading, and night had fallen. And he was supposed to get back on a ship because he was a sailor by trade. He was supposed to get back on a ship the next day, and he was sad that he hadn't caught a goose. And we got back out on the road. As we're driving around kind of the winding roads that are just west of Mivat, we rounded this one turn, and there were 2 ptarmigan standing in the middle of the road. And ptarmigan are these types of birds that are also hunted in Iceland, and they're very popular to eat, especially at Christmas time. And so he just gunned it. He floored this car, and one of the ptarmigan flew away in time, but the other one didn't. And I heard the sound of this bird's head hitting the front bumper of the car. And then he made a quick U-turn and came back, and sure enough, he was lying in the road. And we both got out and inspected this bird, and it looked fine except for the head, of course. And he picked it up and he looked at me and he said, "Do you want it?" And I said, okay. I don't know why, but I agreed to take this bird home with me. And he drove me the rest of the way to Akureyri safely. And folks, I dressed this bird, I cleaned this bird, I roasted this bird, and I ate this bird. And yeah, it was pretty tasty. My third and final ring road trip so far was in August of 2013. So yeah, it's been about 10 years since I last went hitchhiking around Iceland, and just telling these stories, I kind of want to do it again. And this time I wanted to be super duper prepared. So I had adequate camping gear, like a good tent and a sleeping bag. And I also prepared a collection of non-perishable food, or mostly non-perishable food, but food that I wasn't going to have to cook. And I was so proud of the food that I assembled that I took a picture of it and posted it on Facebook, which you can see here. And so I had dried fish, I had bananas, I had peanut butter, I had mixed nuts, I had a lot of dried fruits, and dried fish, if I hadn't mentioned that already, hardfiskar. Anyway, this was definitely nutrition in a sense, but, by day 2 or 3, and generally speaking, if you're taking your time, it'll take about 5 days, I'd say, to circle the country, if you're taking your time and you're not in a huge, huge hurry. But by the 3rd day, I felt I was hungry all the time, and I couldn't figure out why for the life of me. And I realized it was because I wasn't eating any hot food. I don't know what it is about eating hot food, but apparently it's something we kind of have to do every now and then at least. Because by the 3rd day, I felt absolutely ravenously hungry, even though I was technically eating food and getting nutrients in my body. And I got to a gas station and I ordered this Icelandic staple known as shoppubogari, which literally means shop burger. And it's a kind of trashy, kind of thrown together burger that you get at any gas station. And, like a patty, like a hockey puck, stale bread, wilted lettuce, some very suspicious sauce. And it was the best burger I ever had in my life. So definitely at some point, get some hot food in you at least once a day. The most memorable part of this journey to me was when I was in the Northwest and I was picked up by this old man driving a Subaru hatchback. He told me that he was originally a carpenter from Blundos, but he was moving to Reykjavik because he had no more business in Blöndos. And I said that I was going to Reykjavik, and he paused and was considering something, and then he said, okay, I'll drive you all the way to Reykjavik, but only if you agree to help me clean out my barn at my son's farm. And, you know, I wasn't in a big hurry, so I said, sure, I'll help you with that. We drove for about another half hour before we got to his son's farm, which is all the way in this valley. And his son and his son's wife were very nice. They offered me coffee and cake, and we had some coffee and cake. This is kind of a thing with rural Icelanders. If you're a guest, like, you're probably going to be offered at least coffee and maybe also cake. Anyway, after we had our coffee and cake, my ride was like, okay, let's go to the barn. And so we went to the barn, and we were mostly just picking up like these old carpentry tools that he had, and like saws and hammers and what have you, and loading him into this hatchback. And he had kind of this sad demeanor as he was doing this. Like, he really didn't want to be doing this at all. And I realized why after we were done loading up his hatchback to head south again. As he was driving me through the Northwest, he didn't want to go back on Route 1 right away. Instead, he was driving me around this area where he apparently grew up, and he was showing me his sights. And that is like the places that he recognized when he grew up. Like, he would point out the window and say, my best friend used to live on this farm here, but they had to sell the farm because things weren't going so well. And where he's pointing was like a bare hill with an old chimney or some lumber rubble there. He was a really nice guy, and it gave me this pang, this feeling that, like, wow, yeah, there are people who like had to move to Reykjavik. Like, they didn't have any choice. And I went into this in more detail in my video about the divide between urban and rural Icelanders. So if you want more about that, definitely check out that video. In conclusion, it's definitely safe to hitchhike in Iceland, or safer than it is in a lot of other countries. It can be a lot of fun. You can have some life-changing experiences, for sure, as you've just heard. You just have to keep a couple of things in mind in order to keep yourself safe and comfortable and be respectful to the locals. Like, don't do any wild camping. Try to hitchhike in the summer, dress for any sort of weather condition, memorize license plates. Don't accept a ride if the vibe is off. Get some hot food in you, but also take lots of pictures. And if you meet somebody that you like on the road, try to stay in touch with them. Try to exchange some sort of information so that you can stay in contact with one another and maybe be able to meet again at some point in the future. In any event, I really hope that you found this video entertaining and informative, and I hope that you keep it in mind if you ever do want to try hitchhiking in Iceland. Now, this video was a result of a viewer poll that I put on my Patreon, wherein patrons are able to dictate what single topic I cover in a single topic video. And this topic won the last viewer poll. And the viewer polls are things that you can check out on my Patreon. Speaking of which, the next Ask Me Anything session, which is also for patrons, is going to be this Saturday, August 19th. Yes, August 19th at 1600 hours GMT. And it's a wonderful time. We always have a lot of fun at these Ask Me Anything sessions. I hope to see you there. And the viewer polls and the Ask Me Anything sessions are both things you can get in contact with and take part in through my Patreon, which is linked in the description below. Which reminds me, I want to thank Corinne Vasquez, Marianne Ward, Christopher Hunter, Marianne Moores, Kimberly McDaniel, Iceman98, Octavia Hrund-Jonsdottir, and Alan Valgame for being patrons on the $20 level. Ian Kingsley and Laura Johnson for being patrons on the $15 level, and Melissa Pfeffer, Christine Trowbridge, Hafstein Himmellomi Regunason, Stephen Ellis, and Vivi Carvalho Schaffner for being patrons on the $10 level. You folks rock. That's all for me at the Reykjavik News Desk. Be good to each other.